Alina had never noticed how often she looked out the window. Her gaze was drawn to the old house across the street. It was strange, the house had been abandoned for a long time, and she was new to the neighborhood. Yet something made her watch it. Every night, just before closing the curtains, she felt as if the house were living its own life. In the darkness, its silhouette grew even more sinister. Sometimes, a few seconds after she turned away, a faint shadow flickered in one of the windows. One evening, coming home late, she noticed a light in the window. It was dim, as if someone were trying to hide in the darkness. A few days later, where there had been no door before, she saw them. Alina stood on the sidewalk, unable to look away from that window. The light flickered slowly, then went out again. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, forcing herself to move closer to the house. Her heart raced. As she approached, she noticed strange marks beside the door, as if something, or someone, had struggled to break free. Her fingers trembled as she touched the old wooden panel. It was cool, but not cold as it should have been for wood in this old house. Suddenly, there was a muffled sound from inside, as if someone had tripped and then fallen silent. Alina stepped back. For a moment, she thought she saw a shadow in the window again, but now it moved slowly, almost imperceptibly, like mist crawling along the walls before disappearing. Unable to resist her curiosity, Alina raised her hand and tried to push the door. It creaked but didn't budge. However, as if in response, a sound came from the second floor, heavy, hesitant footsteps, as though someone were moving on bent legs, barely able to support their body. Here, in the shadow of this house, questions arose in her mind, questions that had no answers. Why couldn't she leave? Why did this house pull her in? At that very moment, her gaze stopped on a small plaque next to the door. Faint, almost illegible, the inscription read, "Enter, if you want to know who was here." Alina hesitated, stepping back, but then noticed something dark moving in the shadow of her own reflection. Alina stood, unable to tear her eyes away from the shadow, which now spread across the pavement as if trying to capture her. Her heart clenched when she realized it wasn't her reflection moving, but something else. It wasn't just a feeling, there was a scraping sound behind her, as if something were quietly, but steadily, approaching. She spun around quickly, but no one was there. No footsteps, no sounds. Just silence, as if the moment itself was a frozen trap. Approaching the door, Alina tried to read the inscription, but her eyes couldn't focus. The letters danced as if alive. Something inside the house was urging her to come closer. Suddenly, the door gave way. It opened with a sharp click, leaving behind a strange, painful cold that hit her face, as if the darkness inside the house itself wanted to swallow her. "Enter, if you want to know who was here." Now Alina was sure, this wasn't just a warning. It was an invitation. Someone inside the house knew she was watching, knew she couldn't leave. And she couldn't explain why, but she stepped inside. As soon as she crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut with a loud bang. In the darkness around her, something moved, and the air grew heavier. Then, the light in one of the windows flickered on again, and Alina saw a figure standing in the center. It was clearly visible in the dim light that barely illuminated the room. A human body, but the face, completely featureless, with empty eyes staring directly at her. "You've come," the figure whispered, and Alina felt the cold grip her body. At that moment, her gaze fell on an old photograph lying on the floor next to the door. It was dusty, but she could make out only one face, the same faceless person standing in the window. In the background, another person's face was hidden in shadow, as if they didn't exist at all. And in that moment, as Alina bent down to pick up the photograph, a quiet voice whispered again from the shadow. "You won't leave." Alina instinctively recoiled, but her body seemed to not obey her. Every movement came with effort, as if an invisible force was binding her, forcing her to be part of this house, part of its sinister essence. She picked up the photograph, and her fingers immediately felt the coldness of the metal, as if she were touching something that did not belong to this world. When Alina looked at the photo, her eyes widened. She recognized this person. The face without features was the same one she had seen in the window. But now his eyes were open. Not empty. He was staring at her, unblinking, with a painful, ghostly attention. Suddenly, a creak came from the dark corner of the room. At that moment, Alina felt cold grip her throat. She couldn't breathe. Inside the house, something, or someone, was slowly approaching. She tried to move, but couldn't. It was as if her entire body had lost its weight. The shadow in the corner stirred, and the figure emerged again. It was tall, dark, and ominous. It seemed as though the very air around it was losing its shape, and it became the center of all this dark energy. "You don't remember who you are," the figure whispered, and its voice sounded like metal scraping against glass. "But you know you must be here. We are all here because we are awaited." Alina tried to scream, but she couldn't. The sound got stuck inside her. She saw the figure move toward her, and the room around her grew darker. It was as if something was absorbing the light, leaving everything in an abyss. This is not reality, she thought, but her mind no longer listened to her. Then she heard it. A light, barely noticeable sound, footsteps behind her. Not the ones she had heard before. These were different steps. They grew louder, as if someone was coming closer from behind, moving through the darkness. But when she tried to turn, her body wouldn't obey. The moment she felt hands grabbing her from behind, a loud voice sounded in her head. "You are home. Here you will stay." The hands gripping her from behind were cold, like ice. They wrapped around her, preventing her from moving. Alina tried to breathe, but the air grew heavier, and there wasn't enough of it. It felt as if the walls of the house were closing in around her, and every cell of her body screamed that she wouldn't leave here alive. Everything in her mind mixed, fear, panic, the feeling that she had been here for a long time, as if this place had become part of her. Seconds stretched into eternity. She knew she shouldn't look back, shouldn't see what was happening behind her, but something compelled her to turn her head. When she did, she saw something that she couldn't fully comprehend. The shadow standing opposite her wasn't the only being in the room. In the far corner, shrouded in half-light, stood several figures, all featureless and strange, with empty eyes full of pain and anticipation. They were surrounded by mist, as if the air around them was soaked in time and death. One of them started to move, slowly and unnaturally, with smooth, gliding movements, as if its body had no definite form. It came closer, followed by the others. With each step, the air grew colder. Alina screamed, trying to break free from their grip, but the hands wouldn't let go. She couldn't understand how, but she knew, she was here, and she was meant to be here. "You can't leave," said the one standing next to her. His voice was barely audible, but each word cut like a knife. "You came, and now you are one of us." Then the shadows began to move around her, like a vortex, swallowing the light, pulling her deeper into darkness with every motion. Alina felt her body becoming part of this world, as if her own soul was beginning to dissolve into this dark space. In her head, a word echoed, "Death." And suddenly, everything around her disappeared, leaving her in an emptiness where there was no time, no space, only darkness. She couldn't understand whether she was alive or already dead. Everything around her twisted into a spiral, and her body became part of this endless, cold space. The shadows that had clouded her vision began to vanish, but one remained, the one standing at the window. The faceless figure. It slowly turned, and its featureless face once again met her eyes. "Now you know," it said. "You won't leave. This place calls, and you are already here forever." And as the shadow vanished into the darkness, Alina understood that she could no longer return. She was part of this house. Alina tried to dispel the fog in her mind, but the more she struggled, the stronger she felt her body and mind becoming part of this sinister space. Trying to scream, she felt her voice wouldn't come out, and her own words were swallowed by the shadows around her. At some point, she realized she couldn't even move. All her body was bound by icy chains, and the cold wouldn't leave her, seeping into every cell. The darkness around her thickened, and a noise filled the air, like the whisper of many voices. But they weren't alive, they were the long-forgotten voices of those who were already here, in this house. Suddenly, she felt someone touch her shoulder. Cold and sharp, like a blade. Turning, she saw no face, just emptiness, vanishing features that seemed to dissolve into the darkness. It wasn't a person, it was something much older, something formless. A being that filled the space with its presence, needing no body. "You must understand," the being whispered, "you were always here. You just didn't remember." Her eyes widened in horror. This is impossible, she thought, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. But no matter how she searched, there was no way out. The walls of this house, this dark reality, were pulling her in deeper. Then she suddenly understood, it wasn't just a house, it wasn't just a place. It was a closed cycle, a prison for souls. All those who once came here stayed. Their bodies disappeared, but their spirits, their terror, they live in these walls. The same voice sounded again, but this time it was closer, almost in her ear. "You've always been here. You are one of us. We were, are, and will be." A fleeting glance at the photograph she was holding in her hands revealed something strange. The face without features in the photo began to disappear. And in that moment, Alina realized, she wasn't alone. The figure in the window wasn't just an observer, it was her reflection, her future. Her own face was vanishing from this world, dissolving into the shadow. This wasn't the end. This was eternity. When Alina felt her body vanish, when her face dissolved into the dark abyss, she could no longer distinguish where she ended and where this house began. Everything around her became part of her essence. The sounds, the whispers, the shadows, they merged into one. In the final moment, she felt the cold touch blur her consciousness, and one single question returned to her mind: "Do you remember who you are?" There was no answer. And at that moment, everything was once again swallowed by darkness. But suddenly, in the final moment of her existence, like a ray of light in the abyss, she heard something strange, light footsteps, as if someone new was approaching this house, someone who didn't know yet. That same moment reappeared when the door was slightly open, and her gaze once again encountered something familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. The house waits. It always waits.